February 26, 1991, a windowless briefing room in Moscow. Soviet generals stare at a television screen showing CNN. They watch there, a T-72 tanks, the backbone of their entire military, being systematically destroyed, one by one, in total darkness, by something they cannot see. What was killing them? Hit subscribe. We reveal the weapons that changed history. The night is February 26, 1991, 2,230 hours. The open desert of Wadi al-Bat in Kuwait. The darkness is absolute, cold, starless, a black that swallows everything: the sand, the men, the machines. For the commanders of the Iraqi Republican Guard Tawakalna Division, this is their fortress. They're dug in behind sand berms, protected by the armor of their T-72M tanks. This isn't just any tank. This is the direct descendant of the machines that crushed Hitler's panzers at Kursk. The fist of Soviet design, philosophical, numerous, brutally effective. Its 125mm smoothbore gun is a tank killer feared on every battlefield from Eastern Europe to Afghanistan. Tonight, the crews wait, peering through the green-tinted glow of their active infrared sights. They're confident, they're hunters. Then the night whispers. It's not a sound at first, it's a feeling. A pressure change in the air. A low alien whine that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It's the sound of a turbine, a jet engine on sand. The Iraqi commanders listen to radio chatter, static, confusion. Then a report crackles through. Enemy armor visual, but the range is wrong, impossible, over 3,000 meters. The T-72's gun is rated for effective fire at 2,000 meters at best. Their sights are useless beyond that distance. A sergeant in a lead T-72 switches on his crude L4 ear searchlight, a massive infrared lamp mounted next to the gun. It cuts a beam of invisible light into the darkness, painting the desert in ghostly, shimmering green through his TPN-1 gun sight. He's scanning, searching for the source of that noise. He sees nothing, just endless, empty sand. Ever been in total darkness, knowing something's watching you? The first impact is silent. A bright, blinding white line thinner than a pencil streaks out of the total darkness. It crosses 3 kilometers of open desert in less than 2 seconds. It doesn't arc, it doesn't fall. It travels with perfect geometric precision. The T-72 sergeant doesn't see it. He's looking the wrong way. The tank next to him, 30 meters to his left, simply evaporates. There's no explosion in the traditional sense. The kinetic energy penetrator spike of hyperdense metal, moving at over a mile per second, strikes the T-72's frontal glacis plate. It doesn't care about the sloped armor. It doesn't recognize the composite layers. It passes through the steel as if it were cardboard. The laws of physics take over. The friction of that passage heats the metal dart to superheated plasma. As it enters the crew compartment, catastrophic overpressure blows the 18-ton turret 40 feet into the air, a spinning disk of fire. The ammunition carousel below ignites. A jack-and-up-box detonation that vaporizes the 3-man crew instantly. The sergeant spins his own turret, panic clawing his throat. Contact! Contact! Where is it? His radio screams. Another tank is hit, and another. White-hot lines are lancing the darkness from unseen phantoms. The Iraqi crews are firing back blind. Their 125mm guns boom, sending high-explosive shells into the blackness. The shells find nothing. They explode harmlessly in the sand, kilometers short of their targets. They're not in a battle. They're in an execution. Thousands of miles north in a windowless briefing room in Moscow. The mood is not panic. It's cold, academic dread. The men watching the grainy television feed are not Iraqis. They're Soviet generals, marshals of the Red Army, senior analysts from the GRU military intelligence. The channel is CNN. They're watching live as the backbone of their entire military doctrine is broken and set on fire. They see blurry thermal green footage beamed from an American news network. Tiny hot white squares, their tanks being picked off one by tiny black squares. They see columns of T-72s and T-55s. A rolling sea of Soviet steel caught on a highway in what the Americans are calling a turkey shoot. This is not supposed to be possible. The T-72 is the bread and butter of the Warsaw Pact. Thousands of them are pointed at the Fulda Gap in Germany, ready to swarm NATO forces. The entire Soviet plan for World War III hinges on this single machine and the doctrine of massed armor assault. What they're seeing on CNN is not a fair fight. It's not even a fight. It's a technological massacre. A GRU colonel, his face pale, turns to his superior. What is hitting them? The general doesn't look away from the screen. We don't know. The Iraqis have the export model, the T-72M. It's inferior. The colonel offers a desperate plea for rational explanation. Our own T-72B, the T-80, they have Contact 5 reactive armor. They're superior. Are they? The general replies, his voice barely a whisper. He taps a file on the table. The reports from the field, the penetrations, they're happening at ranges we cannot even see. They're happening in darkness, where our best night vision is blind. The Iraqis are firing, and their shells, they say they're bouncing off. Bouncing off. We have preliminary after-action reports from our attaches in Baghdad. They're incoherent. They speak of ghosts, of whispering death, of tanks that move faster than 70 kilometers per hour across open desert, firing with perfect accuracy while moving. The room falls silent, firing on the move. At night, it ranges over 3,000 meters. This is not a quantitative advantage. This is a new dimension of warfare. What would you do if your life's work became obsolete overnight? A junior analyst in the back, fresh from the engineering academy, clears his throat. Everyone turns. Comrade General, what if the problem is not the tank, but the system? What if they're not fighting tanks at all? The reports of Hellfire missiles from helicopters. The A-10 aircraft, those do not leave these signatures. The general snaps, pointing at a blurry reconnaissance photo. This is a tank kill. Look at the entry hole. It's small, clean. A kinetic weapon, but not one of ours, and not one we've ever seen. The mystery settles over them, thick as a shroud. The T-72 was built to fight the American M60, the British chieftain. It was designed to win a war of numbers and attrition. But the Americans hadn't sent the M60. They'd sent something else. Something that hunted in the dark. Something that could not be seen, could not be targeted, and could not be stopped. The Soviet Union's greatest military export, the very symbol of its industrial might, was being turned into scrap metal on live television. And its creators, the marshals in Moscow, could only watch helplessly as their entire life's work, their entire national defense strategy, was proven obsolete in the course of a single night. The investigation had to begin. They had to find out what was killing their tanks. They had to find the phantom. This mystery gets deeper. Hit that like button. The smoke had barely cleared from the Kuwaiti desert before the hunt began in Moscow. The Special Commission, a grim-faced assembly of GRU officers, tank designers from the Uralvagon Z factory, and aging marshals convened in a lead-lined room at the Ministry of Defense. Their mandate was simple: find out what killed the T-72, and find out if the T-80, the premier Soviet tank guarding the homeland, was just as vulnerable. The first pieces of evidence were the ones the whole world saw: the CNN broadcasts. Technicians spent hundreds of hours poring over the grainy, flickering thermal footage. They enlarged it, stabilized it, filtered it. The result was useless. The videos showed what happened: hot white tank hulls blooming in heat, then vanishing, but not how. The resolution was too low, the angles too clean. It was a highlight reel of a massacre, offering no clues to the weapon. The real work fell to the advisors and GRU agents still embedded in the collapsing ruins of the Iraqi regime. This was not espionage. It was battlefield archaeology performed under extreme duress. Soviet teams, ostensibly diplomats and ceasefire observers, bribed, threatened, and bartered their way onto the still smoldering battlefields of Wadi al-Batin and the Highway of Death. They moved at night, dodging unexploded ordnance and jittery American patrols. Their cameras were not for television. They were for forensic analysis. What they found stopped their blood cold. They'd expected to find wrecked T-72s. They hadn't expected to find an open-air museum of their own failures. The tanks were peppered with hits, but the hits were all wrong. A veteran Soviet tank officer who'd seen the aftermath of battles in Afghanistan would expect to see the splash and spall of a high-explosive anti-tank heat round. He would expect large, blackened craters. He would not expect this. On the frontal glacis plate of a T-72M, a place where the crew believed they were invincible, the agents found tiny, neat, almost surgical-looking holes, no wider than a man's fist. There was no charring, no splash, just a perfectly drilled circle. But inside the tank, inside was a vision of hell. The entire crew compartment was a charnel house shredded by a cone of white-hot metal. The force of the impact had turned the tank's own armor into shrapnel, spalling it from the inside wall. In many cases, the projectile had entered the front of the tank, sliced through the crew, and exited out the rear engine block. It had passed through 2 meters of steel, ammunition, and machinery as if it were water. The agents took photographs. They measured the entry holes. They used diamond-tipped saws to cut away sections of armor plating for analysis. And they dug in the sand. They were looking for the bullets. When they found them, the mystery only deepened. Buried in the sand, or sometimes embedded deep inside the engine block of a destroyed tank, they found long, thin metal darts. They looked like oversized arrows, shorn of their fins. They were not steel. They were not tungsten. The Red Army's preferred material for its own anti-tank rounds. They were black, metallic, and impossibly heavy. When the first samples were flown back to the metallurgical labs at the Kubinka Proving Grounds, the spectrometers delivered a result that stunned the engineers. Over 98% depleted uranium. Depleted uranium, the byproduct of nuclear enrichment. A material the Soviets knew well but considered problematic. It was pyrophoric, bursting into flame on impact. It was toxic. It was politically complicated. And it was apparently the densest material their enemy could find to hurl at them at velocities that defied their own physics. This wasn't a shell. It was a man-made meteor. Ever learn something that changed everything you thought you knew? The human intelligence, the human, was even more terrifying. GRU handlers sat in darkened rooms in Damascus and Amman, debriefing, frantic. Demoralized Iraqi tank commanders who'd escaped the slaughter. The stories were wild, contradictory, and laced with primal fear that bordered on superstition. One commander, a colonel in the Tawakkalna division, stared at the wall, his hands shaking. "We were in our BMP," he whispered. "We had the best position. We were scanning with the TPN-1. We saw nothing. Not a light. Not a flicker of heat. Nothing. Then my wingman, he just blew up. The turret went straight up. It spun. I saw it spin. Did you fire back?" The GRU handler asked, his pen scratching on a notepad. "At what?" "At the Jinn. At the ghosts. We fired where the flashes came from. We emptied our ammunition. We hit nothing. We heard on the radio, we heard the sounds. A hiss. Not a diesel engine. Not the vroom vroom of a T-72. A high screaming sound. Like a jet. They said the tanks hissed." A hissing tank. This report was filed away as battlefield shock. It made no sense. Another survivor, a gunner pulled from a burning T-55, gave an even stranger account. "My commander, he saw one. He pointed. He said, 'There, It was 3,000 meters away. A black shape. We fired, we hit it. I saw the flash on the hull. A direct hit with 100 millimeters. It ... It didn't even slow down. It just kept coming. It stopped, it fired, and the commander's cupola was gone. I ran. These reports built a legend. A new American supertank had entered the field. It was a boogeyman. It moved silently with a high-pitched hiss. It was invisible at night. Its armor was so thick that Soviet 125 mm guns were useless, and its gun fired a magic bullet that could not be stopped. Back in Moscow, the Special Commission attempted to sort fact from fiction. What they discovered would shake their entire worldview. The Special Commission's desks were littered with conflicting data. They developed 3 theories. Theory 1. The armor. This was the most popular theory among the old guard. The reports of shells bouncing off were key.
Americans
must have perfected composite armor. Intelligence services had long been chasing rumors of a British invention called Chaba Marma, sandwich of ceramics and steel. Now it was clear the Americans had it, and it had rendered the Red Army's entire stockpile of heat rounds obsolete. The Commission recommended an immediate crash program to develop more powerful heat warheads. Theory 2. The gun. The younger, more technical-minded engineers focused on the depleted uranium darts. This, they argued, was the real threat. The armor was irrelevant if the gun could pierce anything. This was a metallurgical failure. The Soviets needed their own silver bullet. The call went out to design bureaus. We need a projectile that is longer, heavier, and faster. The Svanets 1 and Svanets 2 programs, designed to create new uranium and tungsten rods, were given top priority. Now, Theory 3. The sights. This was the darkest theory, the one the generals did not want to discuss. It was championed by a signals intelligence specialist who'd spent his career studying American electronics. He pointed to the reports. We saw nothing. He pointed to the CNN footage, blurry as it was. Comrades, he said, they are not using infrared searchlights. They are not active. They are passive. They are not looking for a reflection. They are seeing the heat of the tank itself. The room grew cold. The T-72s night vision system, the TPN-1, was an active system. It was, in effect, a giant invisible flashlight. To see, it had to project a beam of IR light. The specialist explained the horrifying implication. Any American tank with a passive thermal imager would see our T-72s as bright as a lighthouse from kilometers away. Oh, we were blind. Worse. The moment we tried to look, we lit ourselves up for them. We were hunters walking through the forest with a lit torch, being stalked by a predator that sees heat. But the Commission, like any bureaucracy, settled on the wrong conclusion. They could not would not accept that all 3 theories were true. They could not grasp that the Americans had not just built a better tank. They had built a system. A tank with a gun that outranged them, sights that made them blind, and armor that made them impotent, all tied together with a computer that let it fire with lethal accuracy while moving at 40 miles per hour. The Soviet mind, steeped in a doctrine of mass and attrition, was looking for a single, simple answer. New gun, a new armor plate, a new sight. They could not understand that the T-72 had not been defeated by a single piece of technology. It had been defeated by a philosophy. When was the last time you realized you were fighting the wrong war? The boogeyman now had a name. It was whispered in intelligence reports, a designation from an American procurement document. The M1, and they had absolutely no idea what it really was. While the Commission in Moscow chased metallurgical ghosts and debated active versus passive night vision, the answer to their mystery was not hiding. It was sitting in plain sight at Fort Irwin, California, and across the plains of West Germany. It was not a single invention. It was a revolution born from a near catastrophe that had occurred almost 2 decades earlier. The shift in perspective doesn't begin in an American lab. It begins on October 6, 1973, in the sands of the Sinai. On that day, during the Yom Kippur War, the world's armored doctrines were set on fire. Israeli tank divisions trained in the classic art of blitz, Creed charged forward, only to be systematically annihilated by Egyptian infantry. These soldiers weren't fielding new tanks. They were fielding small, man-portable, Soviet-made 9 M1 for Malyaka anti-tank guided missiles, what NATO called the Sagar. From thousands of meters away, an Egyptian conscript could guide a small, wire-controlled missile and kill a 50-ton Israeli M60 Patton tank. The tank, the king of the battlefield for 30 years, was suddenly vulnerable, obsolete. For the U.S. Army, which planned to fight a numerically superior Soviet tank army in Europe, this was an existential crisis. Their entire defense of the West hinged on the M60 tank, a machine that could now be killed by a single infantryman hiding in a ditch. The call went out from the Pentagon. We are building the wrong tank. We are fighting the wrong war. We don't need a better M60. We need a replacement for the tank itself. The project, which had been stumbling along under the designation XM815, was given new life, a new budget, and a new, terrifying mandate. It was not to be an evolution. It was to be a total reset. The result was a program built on what engineers called the Big Five systems. And it was these 5 systems that, when combined, created the phantom that haunted Moscow. First came the armor. The problem of the 1970s was the heat round-shaped charges like the Sagar missile that used a focus jet of molten copper to burn through conventional steel plate. Making the steel thicker only made the tank slower and heavier. The solution had to be smarter. British scientists at the Chobham Research Facility had developed a radical answer: composite armor. The Americans took this concept and perfected it under the codename Burlington. It wasn't steel. Was a laminated secret sandwich of high-hardness steel, non-explosive reactive layers, and, most critically, matrices of dense ceramics. When a heat-round's molten jet hit this armor, the ceramic layers would shatter and expand, diffusing the blast, dissipating its energy, and catching the penetrator. When a kinetic dart, like a Soviet T-72's own shell, hit it, the incredibly hard ceramic would shatter the tip of the dart and deflect its path. The new American tank, the M1, would be the first in the world to be protected by it. It was quite literally a fortress on tracks, immune to the very weapons the Soviets had built their entire anti-tank arsenal around. This was the answer to the Iraqi shells bouncing off. They weren't bouncing, they were disintegrating. Second came the gun. Third, and most devastating, was the vision. The Soviet generals were right to be afraid. Their active infrared systems were, in fact, glowing beacons. The M1 had something else. 'Twas one of the first production vehicles in the world to carry a passive thermal imaging system. This thermal sight didn't project a beam. It was a camera, highly advanced, supercooled camera that didn't see light. It saw heat. On a cold desert night, a T-72s engine running, its tracks warm from friction, its gun barrel hot from a previous shot, would glow like a bonfire in the M1 gunner's sight. The American crew could sit, engine off, totally silent, and scan the horizon. They could see everything: a hot tank, a warm soldier, a recently driven truck from kilometers away. In total darkness, through smoke, dust, and even fog, the Iraqis were blind. The Americans were gods, wielding the power of sight in a blacked-out world. And it wasn't just one sight. The M1 had a hunter-killer system. The tank commander had his own independent thermal viewer. He could scan the battlefield, find a target, and designate it. With the press of a button, the turret would slew the gunner's own sight, locking onto the new target. The gunner would fire, destroying the tank. And while the gunner was firing, the commander was already scanning for the next target. Find, slew, kill. Find, slew, kill. This was how a single M1 could destroy multiple T-72s in under a minute, with a speed and efficiency that seemed to the victims like an entire battalion of ghosts. Fourth was the engine. That hissing sound, the Iraqi colonel reported, wasn't battlefield shock. It was the sound of a jet. The M1 wasn't powered by a diesel engine. It was powered by a 1,500 horsepower Honeywell AGT 1500 gas turbine. It was, for all practical purposes, a helicopter engine stuffed into a 60-ton chassis. It was quieter than a diesel, had fewer moving parts, and could run on almost any flammable liquid diesel. Gasoline, jet fuel, even, as one commander joked, cheap tequila. But its true magic was its acceleration. It could propel the massive tank from 0 to 20 miles per hour in 7 seconds. This gave the M1 an agility that was terrifying. It could peek-a-boo over a ridge, fire its gun, and reverse back into cover before a T-72's slow-moving turret could even traverse to aim. Finally, there was the secret sauce, the digital ballistic computer. This was the brain that tied it all together. A Soviet gunner had to use a primitive rangefinder and manually adjust his aim for distance and wind. It was a best guess. The M1 gunner simply put his crosshairs on the target and pressed a button. A laser rangefinder put two within a few meters instantly fed the distance to the computer. Sensors on the turret roof measured wind speed and direction. A pendulum inside measured the tank's own cant. The computer ingested all this data: range, wind, ammunition type, barometric pressure, even the warp of the gun barrel land in a microsecond. It calculated the perfect firing solution. It moved the gun to the exact, precise elevation. The gunner just had to pull the trigger. This was the answer to the firing on the move mystery. The M1's stabilization system was so advanced that the gunner's sight stayed perfectly locked on the target, even while the tank was bounding across rough desert at 40 miles per hour. The gun itself, gyro-stabilized, floated as if on a cloud, independent of the lurching chassis. The commander could be drinking a cup of coffee and it wouldn't spill. The gunner could hold his aim perfectly. This was the Phantom. Not a tank, but a system. A machine with composite armor that stopped Soviet shells, a turbine engine that made it fast and quiet, a thermal sight that made it an invisible hunter, and a computer-guided gun that made it a flawless killer. Comment: could the Soviets have ever caught up to this technology? The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened on a sterile, rain-slick firing range in Meppen, Germany in 1990. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Cold War, for all practical purposes, was over. In a stunning gesture of transparency, or perhaps overwhelming confidence, the newly reunified German government and the U.S. Army invited a delegation of high-ranking Soviet officers to observe a NATO firepower demonstration. The Special Commission from Moscow, their faces grim, their notebooks full of grainy photos and contradictory reports from Iraq, attended. They were there to finally see the boogeyman. They stood on a concrete observation tower, binoculars raised, watching the fog lift from the range. First, the Germans demonstrated their new Leopard 2A4. It was impressive. It raced across the muddy field, its chassis lurching. But its long 120mm gun remained perfectly, eerily still, as if disconnected from the tank. It fired on the move, striking targets at 2,500 meters. The Soviet generals nodded, pressed but not shocked. Their own T-72s had a similar stabilized gun. This was a peer. Then they heard the hiss. From the right, an American M1 Abrams rolled onto the range. It didn't rumble or roar. It whined the high-pitched scream of its turbine engine cutting through the damp air. The sound itself was alien. Then it accelerated. It didn't lumber. It pounced. The 63-ton machine shot forward, plumes of mud flying from its tracks, reaching over 40 miles per hour in seconds. "Watch target Delta," the American liaison officer said calmly, his voice amplified by a loudspeaker. Range, 3,000 meters. The M1, still moving at high speed, didn't stop. It didn't slow. Which had been facing forward, suddenly snapped to the left, independent of the hull. It fired a bright white flash and a crack that echoed off the trees. A second later, the distant man-shaped silhouette of a tank target vaporized. Target echo, 3,500 meters. The commander's independent thermal viewer had already found the next victim. The turret, as soon as the gun had recoiled, slewed again. The gunner's sight locked on. Crack, another hit. The tank had not slowed. The Soviet generals were silent. Their hands holding their binoculars were trembling. Firing on the move at 3,500 meters with first-shot kills.